I want to talk about like what's being attacked here, like what the right is trying to unseat, because what has been so notable about Mexico, first through AMLO and then through Claudia Sheinbaum, has been how successful this project has been. And maybe to get us started, we can talk about, one of the things that might still be fairly controversial in the sense that it's like not completed yet, which is like kind of violent crime in Mexico, right? This is responding to a very horrific event. But I wanted to ask y'all, in the same ways as in the US, where you'll see kind of protests against, different city governments or city officials that don't always kind of line up that well with crime statistics, right? Where cycle crime might be going down, but everyone getting, is going out and getting polled and saying that they're very worried about crime. Is something similar going on in Mexico? I mean, what has Scheinbaum's record been, particularly on violent crime in Mexico?
I'll start out by saying that I think the president's response on the Monday following these demonstrations was actually really instructive. She says, all right, so there are critics, but what are they offering? What is their proposal? Because it sounds like some of them want to go back to the failed strategy of Felipe Calderon from 2006, which was an all-out conflict, all of the strength of the state security forces against select organized crime groups, because, of course, there were some that were benefiting from the state intervention during those years, namely the people who were connected to Garcia Luna, who is now in jail as a result of his connections to organized crime. But I think it's important to think about that. Like, are they proposing that we go back to that, to the so-called war on cartels? Because that's a non-starter in Mexico. Nobody supports that idea except for the hardline opposition, which wants to kind of defend Calderon's legacy for whatever reason. This hardline strategy has been tried and it failed, and it's largely the reason we're in this place in the first place. And what we've seen from Sheinbaum on the security issue has been one that is far more emphasis on investigation, on cutting off the supply of money to these groups to kind of really cut their feet out from under them, as opposed to clashes in the streets. Because, as I said, we've been through this. And what did that produce? All it did was splinter organized crime groups and actually led to more kind of violent and vicious leaders rising up because they were the ones who were going to fill that void. That's not the strategy the government's pursuing now. And I think actually what we're seeing is really important figures in terms of like the actual drops of major crime. But the thing is that there are security challenges in this country, and they will probably never really be solved until our neighbor to the north, the United States, starts treating its problem with the demand side of things as the public health concern that it is, as opposed to the crime issue that it is, or even as we're seeing now, these extrajudicial executions in the Caribbean. A lot of the solution is out of our hands, and so that's what puts us in a difficult position in terms of the iron river of guns, as it's called, that's flowing from the United States into Mexico, that arms these groups, that makes them as violent as they are. The amount of money, all of the laundering that happens in banks in the United States and Mexico that allows them to carry this kind of stuff out. Like, I think that's the thing we need to focus on when we talk about this. But I do think I want to give voice to the legitimate concerns that the population, certainly in places like Michoacan, where this mayor was from, but places like Sinaloa, which are dealing with really serious quality of life issues, right? Because these organized crime groups have now expanded beyond just, drug smuggling and all the rest of it, but like the extortion rackets, for example, the so-called protection fees that they charge small business owners. Those are the things that really kind of are generating a genuine discontent amongst the population, which can be addressed, but arguably, we couldn't even begin to address it until the passage and the implementation of the judicial reform because of the barrier.
On that point, just really quick, but it's not as if like Sheinbaum and before her AMLO were kind of sitting back on their hands on this issue, right?
No, of course not. I mean, AMLO created the National Guard. He saw that the federal police, which was deeply corrupted, many of its leadership is also facing charges or has been convicted of ties to organized crime groups, dissolves that, creates the National Guard that would be on a permanent deployment and actually kind of in communities and addressing the security situation. So there's also been work around that. I think it's important to mention, of course, in terms of like the security situation in this country.
Yeah, so the overall number, Claudia Sheinbaum as mayor of Mexico City reduced violent crime by half in the city. In the first year of her presidency, she's shown she's been able to, because the question was, would she be able to take the successes in Mexico City to the rest of the country, which is a very different country. Rural Mexico is very different from urban Mexico and very different from Mexico City in particular. So far she has, in a national sense, in the sense that she's reduced the murder rate by 37%. in her first year in office, right? If you look back over previous presidents, and Felipe Calderón in 2006, who took office after a fraudulent election, in a bid to kind of legitimate himself and with an inferiority complex over him, launched a war on drugs precisely in that state, Michoacán, his home state, which López Obrador warned at the time that was just going to be whacking the hornet's nest stupidly, without a plan. And it turned out to be right. It spread organized crime out in places where it hadn't existed before, and it fragmented groups. So instead of dealing with a couple major groups, you're dealing with, more. At the same time as Calderón was carrying out this massive war on drugs strategy, basically, Reagan in the 80s and the Plan Colombia in the 90s, trying to import those ideas here, his own security minister was in cahoots with the Sinaloa cartel. Genaro Garcia Luna, who is now in jail in the United States. So, we're talking about complicity at that scale. So when López Obrador comes into the presidency in 2018, he was faced with complicity at basically all levels of the police, which is why he disbanded that previous national police contingent and went with the National Guard, as we mentioned. Now, that said, has the problem been eradicated? Of course it hasn't. And it won't be as long as the dynamic with the United States exists. Have there been advances? Yes, there have. So especially in states like Guanajuato, which concentrated a large number of the assassinations in the country, right? It gets complex because it's not just a straight organized crime bang bang issue, but like any mafia, they diversify into other industries, like extortion, like you said. Michoacán in particular is the state that produces, I think, 70% of the avocados in the country. And of course, that's become a huge export crop to the United States so that everybody can have their, guacamole dip for the Super Bowl. So organized crime then forces people to plant avocados and gets into that racket, or limes, or the water issue. In a country that's increasingly has water problems, Michoacán is water rich. It's mineral rich. So that means, it diversifies, and then you have to diversify your way of going about it. And it's important to note that there have been, a number of mayors assassinated in Michoacán over recent years. And there have been, other towns like Cuitzeo, which is in the Bajío region, where the current mayor, I think, has faced 3 different attempts. Wow. So no one wants to minimize it, and one has to have a great degree of sensitivity to people who are in those parts of the country where organized crime is a part of their daily lives. And not minimize it and not just try to throw statistics at them, right? Has to have that very front and center. But at the same time, not let that become, right, a club with which international far-right interests can use to whack a very popular progressive government that is doing good things on a large number of fronts.
Well, and I would just add, we've covered this a bit on Left Reckoning with other folks, but I think it's an important thing to remember that, organized crime does not live in a vacuum outside of global capital. And there's a kind of a violent aspect to this, as you're kind of noting, even just with agricultural products. Mexico, but